So for the PCOR stakeholder interview presentation, I am going to talk on the mobility preferences of caregivers caring for individuals with stroke. So a little on why I chose this topic. Every year, around 795,000 people in the United States suffer from stroke. Most of these individuals who suffer from stroke have residual effects that impair their mobility. And around 40% of these individuals suffer at least one fall. Hence, the objective of this interview was to understand the caregiver outcome preferences related to mobility following stroke. So this slide talks about the stakeholders that were recruited by me for the particular objective. The participants were caregivers who were caring for individuals with stroke. And more so, these individuals with stroke whom they were caring for should have had received rehabilitation in either an inpatient rehabilitation facility or a skilled nursing facility. So, if the individual with stroke received rehabilitation in either of these two settings, these caregivers were recruited for this interview. The place where the recruitment was conducted was the Houston Stroke Warriors Support Group. Each interview took around 20 to 40 minutes to be completed. And this interview process was completed as a part of the project that I have been involved with, which is here in UTMB, called as the Patient Centered Outcomes Research in Elderly, which is an R24 project funded by the AHRQ. A little about the recruitment strategy. So, since the stakeholder groups were identified and the purpose of the project was also identified, um, the best methodology to be recruited for these caregivers to be recruited was through stroke support group. So, hence, I called and emailed all the stroke support groups in the Houston and Galveston area. Of all the support groups, the Houston Stroke Warriors support group, the staff responded to our request immediately. Once the request was responded to, me and the project coordinator visited the site in Houston and spoke to the stroke support team coordinator about our project. And they informed us that the team meets every Saturday between 10:30 a.m. to noon. So the best way we decided for interviewing and recruiting these caregivers was rather than calling them at a separate time or by going to their house, we decided that we would recruit them when they visited or attended the stroke support group meeting every Saturday between 10:30 a.m. to noon. And this was the easiest strategy because previously, when we tried to recruit individuals via phone, it was difficult to determine a convenient time point both for me as an interviewer and the person or the caregiver. And even the location was difficult to be pinned down, more so because most of the people were in the Houston area and not many people are comfortable to be interviewed at home, or they want to spend separate time for this project to be interviewed. So the best way to interview them was determined by recruiting them when they attended the stroke support group meeting. So on day one, when we attended the meeting, um, we as team members introduced ourselves with the stroke survivors out there, the caregivers and staff, and briefly explained the nature of the project and asked them to provide their names and demographic information if they were interested to be contacted or to participate in the project. And we got a list of individuals, the caregivers who were interested to talk to us on the preferences after stroke. So once these caregivers were identified, and we did have their names in the first session, what we did was in subsequent sessions, we contacted them and we went to the stroke warriors group meeting and asked them to participate. So to talk about the interview process, in-depth qualitative open-ended interviews were conducted with five caregivers who were caring for individuals with stroke. And as I mentioned, these individuals with stroke should have had received rehabilitation from an inpatient rehab facility or a skilled nursing facility. And to conduct these interview, before conducting these interviews, a predetermined semi-structured interview questions was formulated. This slide shows the open-ended questions that were formulated. So we briefly wanted to know from the caregivers about what therapy or services were received, what the goals, what their goals in rehabilitation for the stroke patient are or were, the results from the rehabilitation, what was most important for them, what would have been helpful if they wanted to share information with others, and what they wish they would have done looking back, and looking forward, what they think is most important for them. So, just talking about the mobility needs for the caregivers from these five interviews, of the five caregivers that were included, had a mean age of around 61 years. Four of them are female, and one of them was a male. Three of them were caring for individuals receiving rehabilitation in an IRF unit, that is the inpatient rehab facility unit, and two of them were caring for an individual who received rehabilitation from a skilled nursing facility. Amongst all the mobility preferences, all the caregivers, all five of them, said that they wanted the individual whom they were caring for to be able to walk. The other mobility preferences that were highlighted by these caregivers were use of assistive devices such as a walker or a power wheelchair. And the other one was having home accommodations such as a tilt bed or widened doors for individuals with stroke to improve safety because these accommodations would prevent falls. So, in this slide, I would like to highlight the lessons learned when I was involved in the interview process. By conducting these interviews over a long period, not only these five interviews, but many more, I realized that it's very important to be consistent in the structure of the questions or the probes in which the questions have been asked or in one interview. And it's important to be consistent in all subsequent interviews because that helps us to have a better organization, which helps us to retrieve the themes or retrieve the important areas that are highlighted by these stakeholders. If a consistent structure is being used, it's easier for us in the next step to retrieve these themes. Also, I realized that it's very important to collect the demographic information from the stakeholders before the interview process. Um, Initially, I did not have a predetermined structure where the demographic information was collected. It was either much before the individual was recruited, or it was in the middle of the interview, or it was much later in the end of the interview. So when I had to get all information about the demographics from all the stakeholders, it was at different places, and it was difficult for me to retrieve them in a convenient manner. And I spent a lot of time doing this. So, what I realized was it was much, much easier to collect these demographic information, maybe in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet that we can carry along with us. And ask them right before conducting the interview. And also we can audio record it in case we need it at a later stage to just confirm our findings or confirm what we had jotted down in the paper. The other most important thing I guess was for me was to make sure to align the stakeholder to the question asked in a subtle way. What I mean by this is sometimes one of the probes or one of the open-ended questions that I had was, what are your goals um, for the stroke survivor um, at this point? So most of the times what happens is they start talking one thing, but because of the event of things that has happened with them during the past X amount of years from the time the stroke survivor um, was in the rehabilitation process, I realized that these caregivers were distracted and they used to get into a tangent to an other topic. So it's very important for me as an interviewer to align them and to the question that's being asked and make sure that they answer that question in a subtle way, more so not trying to interrupt them, because what happens is sometimes when they're talking about something else, some other interesting concept can emerge. But in that way, it's important to make sure that we are within a time limit and the caregiver or the stakeholder is answering the question that's been asked, rather than a research topic which may be interesting, but it may be too much for us to explore, because these interviews, the process can take up to 45 to 50 minutes if the caregivers or if the stakeholders are not aligned or the question is not suitably asked. I also realized that if any new information is being obtained from the stakeholder, it is essential to probe them. And the way to probe them is to ask them open-ended questions for that particular new information that came across, rather than framing the questions in a yes-no format, because this would be this as an interviewer, we would be leading them to ask a question which may not be necessarily the best option for us. So we would rather want to know their opinion or their experiences, so probe them in a way that they can talk more about it. Like, for example, I can give probes like, oh, you mentioned walking is an important goal for you. Could you talk a little more about it? And the most important lesson I learned was, after each interview, it's essential to review the whole process. So once the notes have been taken after every interview or the interview has been transcribed, it's essential to read the interview and the format and reflect on how the interview has been asked and how the individual answered these questions. Is there a way that we could probe in a different way or try to ask questions that's more relevant to the topic area, and accordingly make changes to the interview questionnaire and implement that in subsequent interviews? Thank you.